The night was still, the kind of silence that makes you notice your own breathing. History often feels like a distant echo, something trapped in books or whispered in dusty libraries. But the truth is different. Behind the castles, the knights, the great battles, and the painted saints of medieval times, there lived people who were just as real as you and me. They laughed, they suffered, they dreamed, and they feared. And sometimes, in the shadow of candlelit streets and narrow alleyways, they trembled because of something far more terrifying than war or famine. Because of people who walked among them with hearts colder than stone. We often think of serial killers as a modern phenomenon, monsters of the last few centuries, but the medieval world had its share of them too. Their names might not always appear in schoolbooks, yet their stories linger in court records, folk tales, and old chronicles written in ink that has barely survived the centuries. These were men and women who took advantage of a world where law enforcement was fragile, where superstition blurred the line between guilt and innocence, and where the cries of victims often faded before anyone even knew they had vanished. Imagine living in a time when the streets at night were lit only by the moon. No police patrols, no phones to call for help, no street lamps to keep the darkness at bay. When someone disappeared, neighbors might shrug and say perhaps the forest spirits took them, or maybe they had angered God. In such a world, a cunning killer could hide in plain sight, preying on the vulnerable while cloaking themselves in respectability or fear. But what makes this history strange, and maybe a little haunting, is that many of these figures were not seen as simple criminals. Some are treated as demons, cursed souls, or even legendary creatures. The medieval mind, after all, did not separate the natural from the supernatural the way we do today. If a man killed children in secret, was he just wicked, or was he in league with the devil himself? If a woman poisoned her neighbors one by one, was she a criminal or a witch? These questions shaped not only how these killers were punished, but also how they were remembered. Tonight, in this story, we are not going to run through battlefields or crown kings. Instead, we're going to walk slowly through those darker corners of medieval history. We will hear about figures whispered of in taverns and monasteries, about crimes so shocking that even hardened chroniclers wrote with trembling hands. Some of these tales are well documented. Others blur into legend, passed down through rumor. But together, they paint a picture of a world where death came not only from plague and war, but sometimes from the neighbor next door. One of the names that still echoes through medieval history is Gilles de Rais. On the surface, he was everything a noble knight should be. Wealthy, powerful, a companion of the famous Joan of Arc, even praised for his bravery. But behind the walls of his castles, another story unfolded, one that would shock France for generations. Yet Gilles is only one piece of this puzzle. Long before him and long after, there were others who turned cruelty into a pattern, leaving trails of whispers and fear. There was the so-called werewolf of Bedburg, a man who villagers believed could turn into a beast at night and prowl the countryside. There were mysterious nobles whose rivals vanished, and healers accused of mixing more than herbs into their brews. Some killers may have been ordinary criminals, but the way people told their stories transformed them into something larger than life, into warnings, into shadows that never fully disappeared. As we move deeper into these tales, you will notice something peculiar. The killers of medieval times were not just individuals. They became symbols. They represented the fears of the age, the fear of the devil, the fear of witchcraft, the fear of hidden corruption within society's highest ranks. And because of that, their stories did not end with their deaths. They grew, spreading from one village to another, retold by travelers and monks, embroidered with details until history and legend blended together. But maybe that's what makes them so chilling. Because when you strip away the legends, the heart of the story is the same as today. People who use the trust of others, or the chaos of their times, to harm again and again. And in a world where records were scarce and punishment often brutal, we can only imagine how many more escaped notice entirely, leaving behind nothing but silence. This is the hidden side of medieval history. not the knights and saints, but the outcasts, the predators, the figures whose stories were meant to serve as warnings. And as you listen, remember that people centuries ago heard these same names by firelight, with the same shiver running down their spines. Yet, there's another layer to these stories, one that might surprise you. Not all of them were true in the way we think of truth today. Some killers were very real, with trials, confessions, and executions recorded in detail. Others were products of fear, scapegoats blamed during times of crisis, their crimes exaggerated or even invented. To the medieval mind, the difference didn't always matter. If someone was accused of poisoning wells during a plague or of stealing children under the full moon, the story itself became reality in the eyes of the people. This raises a question. How do we tell the difference now? Centuries later? How do we separate the flesh and blood killers from the legends built around them? That's part of the mystery we will walk through together in this series. Picture yourself in a medieval village. The air smells of smoke from peat fires. Animals crowd the muddy streets, and everyone knows everyone. Then, slowly, children begin to vanish. No one sees where they go. Whispers start, pointing fingers at strangers or even respected figures. Fear grows heavier than the church bells tolling at dawn. At what point does rumor turn into truth? And when the village finally drags someone before a judge, is that person guilty of all the horrors they are accused of, or just unlucky enough to be chosen as the scapegoat? It is in this fragile space between truth and legend that the most notorious medieval killers exist. They are half human, half monster in the records that remain, and perhaps that is exactly how people wanted to remember them. Because to admit that they were just ordinary men and women, with ordinary faces, might have been more frightening than believing in werewolves or demons. So, as you settle in, maybe ready to drift off to sleep with the quiet rhythm of history in your ears, think of this as more than a lecture. Think of it as a journey through the kind of tales whispered when the candles burned low, when the medieval world seemed most haunted, and when the line between human cruelty and the supernatural was nearly invisible. But let me warn you, once we start naming these figures, once we begin to unravel their stories, you might find yourself listening more closely than you expected. Because even centuries later, their shadows reach across time, reminding us that evil has never belonged to one era alone. And so, we begin with the sound of footsteps echoing through a narrow medieval alley, with the torchlight flickering against stone walls, and with the knowledge that someone is watching from the shadows. Who is the figure waiting there, hidden behind the mask of nobility or the disguise of a commoner? And why, even now, does history still whisper their name? That is the first story we will uncover. But before we open the door to it, let me ask you, what if the truth you think you know about medieval times is only half the story? What if the real history lies not in the kings and queens, but in the secrets kept by ordinary people who dared not speak too loudly? And what if, in the silence of those centuries, we can still hear the footsteps of killers whose stories are not yet finished? We will pause here, at the threshold of the first tale, where the darkness of medieval nights hides secrets waiting to be revealed. The next step will take us deeper into one of the most chilling stories of all, a man celebrated as a hero in his lifetime, only to be unmasked as something far more sinister when the truth came to light. The story of Gilles de Rais is often remembered as one of the darkest tales in medieval history, not because it began with darkness, but because it began with light. Born into a wealthy and powerful family in 1405, Gilles was raised in the glittering world of French nobility. He inherited vast lands, castles, and influence at a young age. To those around him, he appeared destined for greatness. And for a time, he lived up to that promise. He fought bravely in the 100 Years' War, serving alongside none other than Joan of Arc, the young peasant girl who inspired an army and shifted the fate of a kingdom. Imagine the image of him, then, armor polished, banners flying, his name spoken with pride as he stood near one of the most iconic figures of the medieval world. Gilles was celebrated as a warrior, a defender of France, a nobleman whose courage seemed unshakable. To the world outside, He was everything a knight should be. But history would later reveal that behind the mask of chivalry, there was a darkness so deep that even centuries later it unsettles the imagination. How does a man admired as a hero turn into a figure whispered about as a monster? That is the puzzle of Gilles de Rais. Some say it was greed, others point to superstition, still others to the strange mixture of power, isolation, and obsession that can warp the mind. What we know is this. After the war ended and Joan of Arc was gone, Gilles retreated into his castles. He withdrew from the world, surrounding himself with servants, priests, and scholars who indulged his every whim. With his fortune, he staged elaborate theatrical performances, spending beyond reason until his wealth began to crumble. And as his riches dwindled, whispers began to rise. Those whispers spoke of missing children, boys and girls who had last been seen near his estates, who never returned home. Families who feared to speak too loudly, but who could not ignore the emptiness left at their hearths. At first, nothing was done. After all, this was Gilles de Rais, noble, knight, hero. Who would dare accuse such a man? But as time passed, the shadows grew longer, and stories began to reach the ears of church authorities. It was said that Gilles dabbled in alchemy, desperate to restore his lost wealth. Some claimed he sought forbidden knowledge, calling upon dark powers in hopes of creating gold from lead. With him, he kept so-called magicians, men who promised secret rituals and ancient wisdom. And somewhere within those rituals, it was said, the line between experiment and cruelty blurred. When Gilles was finally brought to trial, the accusations shocked, even hardened medieval judges. Dozens of witnesses testified about children taken into his castles, about strange rituals, about servants ordered to silence cries behind thick stone walls. Whether all of it was true, or whether some was woven from rumor and fear, remains debated. But in 1440, Gilles de Rais was convicted and sentenced to death. His downfall stunned France. A man once seen as a saintly companion of Joan of Arc now stood condemned as one of the most feared criminals of his age. This is where the medieval mind adds another layer to the story. To us today, Gilles de Rais might seem like a criminal, a nobleman who abused his power and wealth. But to people then, his actions were interpreted in the language of demons and the devil. He was not simply a murderer. He was viewed as someone who had sold his soul. His crimes were not only against people, but against God himself. And so his story lived on, not merely as history, but as legend, a cautionary tale retold in whispers by candlelight. Yet Gilles was only one figure among many. Across Europe, other names surfaced, some remembered, others nearly forgotten, each carrying their own mixture of truth and myth. In Germany, the story of Peter Stump, the so-called werewolf of Bedburg, terrified villagers. He was accused of shape-shifting into a wolf, roaming the countryside, and preying on those unlucky enough to cross his path. Whether he was truly guilty of all the horrors laid at his feet, or whether fear and superstition built his legend larger than life, his story reflects how the medieval world struggled to explain cruelty. To them, it was easier to believe a man turned beast than to face the idea of ordinary evil in human form. There were also the quiet killers, those who slipped through the cracks of history. Herbalists accused of poisoning wells. Midwives blamed when newborns died under mysterious circumstances. Nobles suspected of plotting their rivals' deaths, not on the battlefield, but through subtle acts of treachery. Each tale reveals the fragility of life in those times, and the way rumor could grow as powerful as fact. But here is what makes these stories haunting, even now. They remind us that medieval people were just as vulnerable to fear as we are. They did not have the explanations of science or the systems of modern justice to guide them. When someone vanished, when a sickness spread, when cruelty showed its face, they turned to the only answers they knew: demons, witches, werewolves, curses. In that world, killers were not just criminals. They were symbols of chaos breaking into daily life, reminders that the fragile balance of their world could be shattered in an instant. And yet, if we listen closely, we can hear the human side behind the legends. the grieving parents who searched for missing children, the villages where suspicion tore neighbors apart, the judges who struggled to separate fact from rumor, knowing their decisions carried the weight of life and death. Even the accused themselves, whether guilty or not, became part of a drama larger than their own lives, their names preserved in ink and fear for centuries to come. What makes this history worth revisiting is not the horror alone, but the glimpse it gives us into how people once understood the world. For them, killers became monsters because to see them as ordinary humans was too unbearable. And perhaps that tells us something not only about their time, but about ours. As we move deeper into this story, I want you to picture the setting more vividly. The echo of boots on stone floors in a castle where torches sputter. The heavy silence of a village at night, when the only sound is the wind moving through the trees. The tension in a crowded courtroom, where everyone waits to hear whether the accused will confess. These are not just details. They're the heartbeat of the medieval world. They make the past real, alive, close enough to touch. But here is where the suspense thickens. For every Gilles de Rais whose crimes were dragged into the light, there may have been others who escaped notice entirely. Records from the Middle Ages are incomplete, sometimes deliberately destroyed, sometimes lost to time. What secrets were buried with them? How many stories were never told, leaving only gaps that historians can barely guess at today? That is the cliff edge we stand on now. We know some of the names, some of the tales. We can trace the trials, the accusations, the legends. But what lies in the silence between them may be just as unsettling. Because if the medieval world had its notorious killers, how many more lived and died without ever being caught, without ever being named, their stories vanishing into the shadows? And so, as we prepare to step into the next chapter, keep that question in mind. When you hear the names preserved in history, remember the countless nameless ones hidden behind them. The ones whose footsteps were never recorded, whose crimes were whispered but never proven, whose shadows remain with us even now. What if the most chilling killers of medieval times are not the ones we know, but the ones we never will? The medieval world was a place of contrasts. Cathedrals rose toward the heavens, filled with stained glass and song, while just beyond their doors, muddy streets swarmed with beggars, merchants, thieves, and strangers who carried secrets no one dared ask about. In such a world, the line between good and evil often seemed thin, and the people who blurred that line became both feared and unforgettable. One of the strangest things about this era is how often cruelty was hidden behind masks of respectability. Nobles could walk in silk robes by day and still carry darkness in their hearts by night. Priests might preach sermons that stirred the soul, while rumors whispered of sins behind closed doors. In a society where appearances mattered more than truth, a clever killer could hide in plain sight. And perhaps that is why their stories strike such a nerve, even centuries later. These were not faceless monsters. They were neighbors, leaders, respected figures. To think that someone celebrated in the daylight could transform into a predator in the shadows is unsettling, not only for medieval people, but for us today. In France, long before Gilles de Rais was unmasked, villagers spoke of men who prowled the forests, luring travelers to their doom. Bandits were common enough, but sometimes their brutality was so relentless, so patterned, that people whispered of something worse. In Germany, stories spread of landlords who entertained guests only to see them vanish, their wealth quietly absorbed into the host estates. Whether fact or legend, these tales took on a life of their own, passed from mouth to mouth until they became warnings disguised as stories. Perhaps the most chilling cases, though, were not always those of nobles, but of ordinary people who blended into the rhythm of daily life. In England, chronicles tell of poisoners who made a living by selling deadly concoctions to those desperate enough to rid themselves of rivals. These wise women or cunning men might have started as healers, but somewhere along the line, their brews shifted from cures to curses. To the people of their villages, the difference between healer and killer could be razor thin, and sometimes it was only discovered when it was too late. It is worth pausing to think about the world these people lived in. Imagine a town where sickness struck without warning, where a single spoiled loaf of bread could lead to death, where wars swept through leaving famine in their wake. In such uncertainty, it was not hard for fear to take root. If someone died suddenly, who was to blame? If 3 neighbors fell ill after drinking from the same well, was it disease, or was it someone's deliberate hand? In a time without science, suspicion filled the gaps left by unanswered questions. And in those gaps, accusations grew. But there were also cases where cruelty was undeniable, where patterns were too clear to ignore. In Italy, court records mention men accused of murdering travelers along trade routes, disposing of bodies in rivers or forests. In Spain, rumors spread of innkeepers who grew rich while their guests mysteriously disappeared. In Eastern Europe, tales of blood drinkers and ghouls began to circulate, blurring the line between human killers and supernatural creatures. These were the seeds of legends that would later evolve into vampires and werewolves, but at their root lay something much more human: fear of those who preyed on the innocent. And yet, what makes these stories more than just tales of horror is how they reveal the society around them. Each case tells us what people feared most. In cities, it was strangers who came and went without a trace. In villages, it was the neighbor who might harbor jealousy or secret grudges. In noble courts, it was rivals who could poison with a smile. Each killer became a reflection of the anxieties of the time. There's also something haunting in how justice was carried out. Trials in the medieval world were not like trials today. Sometimes there were witnesses, testimonies, and confessions. But just as often, justice relied on ordeals, plunging a hand into boiling water, carrying hot iron, or being thrown into a river to see if one would sink or float. People believed that God himself would reveal guilt or innocence. Imagine standing accused of terrible crimes, knowing your fate might rest not on evidence, but on whether you blistered too quickly or floated the wrong way. For some, these ordeals sealed their innocence. For others, they were a death sentence disguised as divine will. The killers of medieval times lived in this strange balance between fear, faith, and superstition. To us, their stories might feel like dark curiosities, but to the people who lived through them, they were immediate and terrifying. Every disappearance, every unexplained sickness, every whispered rumor could ignite suspicion that someone among them was not what they seemed. Take the example of the so-called werewolf of Bedburg, Peter Stump. He was not only accused of terrible crimes, but of transforming into a wolf to commit them. His case became infamous not just because of the accusations themselves, but because of what they revealed about belief. To the villagers, it was easier to accept that he was a literal werewolf than to believe he was simply a man capable of such cruelty. His story became a fusion of fact and myth, showing how medieval minds made sense of the unimaginable. But perhaps the greatest mystery is how many of these stories we will never fully untangle. Were they truly serial killers as we understand them today, people who killed again and again for reasons beyond survival? Or were some of them victims of their time, accused because fear demanded someone to blame? The medieval world leaves us with fragments, trial documents, chronicles, rumors. It is up to us to piece them together, knowing the full truth may always remain out of reach. And yet, that uncertainty is what gives these tales their power. They are not neat or tidy. They are raw, unfinished, echoing with the voices of the people who live them. They remind us that history is not just kings and battles, but ordinary people caught in extraordinary fear. As you listen to these stories, perhaps drifting towards sleep, think of how these names once carried weight in the dark. Think of the villagers who whispered them around hearths, the children warned not to stray too far from home, the judges who felt the pressure of both law and superstition pressing down on their decisions. These people lived with the same heartbeat of fear that we feel when we hear tales of danger today. And as the torches of their world flickered against stone walls, shadows grew long, and those shadows often hid secrets too dark to imagine. Some of those secrets eventually surfaced, leading to trials, executions, and legends. Others sank silently into the earth, leaving only traces that still make us wonder. It is in that silence, between what we know and what we can never know, that the true suspense lies. The most notorious killers of medieval times were not only those who were named, but also those whose stories died with their victims. Their silence still lingers, like the echo of footsteps in a dark corridor, always just ahead, always out of reach. And that is where we find ourselves now, standing at the edge of history's shadows, about to step into another story where truth and legend collide. A story where power, fear, and secrecy created the perfect stage for evil to thrive unseen. The question is, when the curtain lifts, will we be ready to face what waits in the dark? To understand the terror that spread when whispers of killers arose in medieval times, you first have to understand the world those people lived in. It was not only dark in a physical sense, but in an emotional one too. Nights stretched longer than they do for us, not because of the turning of the earth, but because there were no lamps, no glowing windows, no comforting hum of life after the sun went down. When the sky dimmed, the world truly disappeared into shadows. In that kind of silence, every creak of wood, every howl of a dog, every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. People learned to fear the dark, and the dark became the perfect hiding place for the cruelest of men and women. Life itself was fragile. Plague, famine, and war came often, like storms that no one could predict or stop. Families could lose children to sickness in a single night, or lose them forever to hunger or conflict. So when people vanished without explanation, when travelers never arrived, or when rumors grew of someone taking advantage of that chaos, the fear cut deeper than anything else. It was not only the act of killing that terrified communities, it was the mystery of it, the idea that something or someone was lurking in plain sight, unstoppable and unseen. That is what gave birth to so many legends, because legends gave people answers. If someone was accused of being a werewolf, it explained why livestock had been torn apart. If someone was said to be in league with the devil, it explained why misfortune followed them. Belief filled the gaps where truth could not be found, and in those gaps killers could either hide or be created by rumor alone. Think of a medieval village, maybe 50 or 100 families, their houses clustered together, surrounded by fields and forests. Everyone knew everyone. Strangers stood out. News traveled quickly. Yet when children disappeared, when women were found lifeless near rivers, or when merchants never reached the town square, the community struggled to decide who was to blame. Was it a wild animal? Was it bandits on the road? Or was it someone sitting quietly among them at Sunday Mass? The fear of not knowing was often worse than the truth itself. And sometimes the killers were not strangers at all. In some cases, they were respected members of society. A knight, a landowner, even a man of the church. Their position gave them protection, because who would dare accuse someone of such high rank? That is part of what made the downfall of men like Gillister Rice so shocking. People could not reconcile the image of a noble hero with the accusations whispered against him. But when testimonies piled up, when rumors became undeniable, the truth, whether entirely accurate or partly molded by fear, shattered their faith in appearances. Beyond France, there were other figures remembered in chronicles, each carrying their own strange blend of crime and myth. In the forests of Germany, villagers feared the tales of men who turned into beasts, stories that would eventually feed the legends of werewolves. In Eastern Europe, strange accounts began to surface of nobles who drew strength from the lifeblood of others, stories that centuries later would shape vampire folklore. In England, towns whispered of poisoners and secret killers who left no wounds, only silent deaths that struck like a curse. What tied these stories together was not only cruelty, but secrecy. Killers in medieval times thrived because no one could fully prove what they had done until it was too late. Evidence was fragile, confessions often forced, testimonies sometimes driven by fear, and records scattered or lost. It is this uncertainty that makes their stories echo centuries later, because we cannot step fully into their world. We are left to imagine it, piecing together fragments like broken glass, never sure what is truth and what is reflection. But here is what we do know. People lived with the same emotions we live with now. They felt the same fear of losing their loved ones. They felt the same anger when injustice struck. And they felt the same unease when danger seemed invisible, hidden in the familiar. That human side is what makes these tales more than just history. They are reminders of how fragile trust can be, how quickly safety can vanish. Imagine walking down a medieval street at night. The cobblestones are uneven beneath your feet. The smell of smoke hangs heavy in the air, mixed with the faint scent of animals. Behind shuttered windows, families huddle close to their fires, whispering prayers for protection. The moonlight barely touches the alleys, and you hear footsteps echoing behind you. Are they friend or foe? Is it a neighbor returning home? Or is it someone following too closely? That uncertainty, that ever-present edge of suspicion, shaped how people lived. And it was not only the poor who suffered. Nobles feared assassination by rivals. Merchants feared betrayal by those they trusted on the road. Even kings were not immune, for history holds tales of rulers poisoned in their own halls, their deaths wrapped in mystery. The shadow of killers stretched across every class, reminding all that wealth and power could not shield them from human cruelty. But perhaps the most chilling thought is this. How many names were never written down? How many people vanished without anyone ever knowing why? For every Gillis de Rice or Peter Stump, there may have been dozens whose stories were swallowed by time. The medieval world did not record every detail of ordinary lives. When the poor disappeared, when peasants were silenced, their stories often vanished with them. That silence may hide some of the darkest truths of all. As we listen now, centuries later, we can almost hear that silence. We can imagine the unanswered questions, the nights when villagers gather by firelight, telling each other to beware of the forest, to beware of strangers, to beware even of those they thought they knew. Those warnings, born of fear, shaped the way people lived, the way they raised their children, the way they trusted or distrusted those around them. And yet, even in their fear, people sought explanations. They looked for patterns. They tried to make sense of the senseless. If killers struck again and again, they wanted to believe there was a reason, even if that reason was something supernatural. It was less terrifying to believe in monsters than to believe in ordinary cruelty, because monsters at least followed rules of legend. But men and women who killed without reason, that was chaos in its purest form. That is why these medieval killers became larger than life. They were not only remembered for what they may have done, but for what they represented. They became symbols of the dangers lurking in the shadows, warnings to keep children close, lessons about pride, greed, or sin. Even when the truth is unclear, the meaning of their stories remains. And so, as we stand here in the present, looking back, the mystery only deepens. Were they truly what the records say? Were they as monstrous as the legends claim? Or were some of them trapped by rumor, condemned because fear demanded a sacrifice? The medieval world does not answer these questions fully. It leaves them hanging in the air, just out of reach, where they still linger like smoke from an old fire. The deeper we look into their world, the more we realize that the tension never resolves. There is no neat ending, no final chapter that ties everything together. The killers of medieval times remain part fact, part myth, part silence. And perhaps that is what keeps us listening, leaning closer, wanting to know more. Because even now, centuries later, the question remains, who was hiding in those shadows, and how many of their stories have we never heard? The deeper we step into the world of medieval life, the more we begin to see how fragile the line was between safety and danger, trust and betrayal. In villages where everyone knew each other by name, and in towns where gossip carried faster than the wind, people still lived with a constant undercurrent of fear. Not fear of foreign invaders or grand battles alone, but of something far more unsettling, danger that came from within. What haunted people most was the idea that their neighbor, their friend, or even a familiar traveler passing through could secretly harbor the darkest of intentions. It was not the obvious threats that unsettled communities, but the ones that hid behind familiar smiles. This was the landscape where legends of notorious killers grew, taking on shapes larger than life. Some were real, others exaggerated, but all carried the weight of truth enough to make people lock their doors at night, if they even had doors at all. One figure often whispered about in medieval lore was a man whose name, though changed through countless retellings, became a symbol of terror. He was described as someone who lived far from the bustling centers of society, deep in forests where roads twisted like serpents and shadows never seemed to lift. Travelers vanished on these paths, their belongings discovered months later, scattered or sold in distant markets. No court record survived to prove his existence, but the tales passed through generations were enough to make cautious families warn their children never to stray too far alone. What makes these stories more chilling is how ordinary they always began. A weary traveler offers food, a friendly neighbor provides shelter, and then silence. It was this unsettling possibility that kept fear alive, because anyone could fall victim without warning. In cities, the fear was different but equally sharp. Narrow streets, lined with flickering lanterns, were places where shadows offered hiding places for more than just rats. Markets bustled during the day, but at night, the same stalls stood silent, with only the sound of distant footsteps echoing through the air. In these places, people spoke of killers who targeted not strangers on the road, but their very neighbors. Some accounts tell of merchants who dealt honestly in the daylight, only to vanish into the alleys under the moon to carry out deeds so grim that no one dared accuse them openly. In a world where authority was often corrupt and justice uneven, many crimes were never properly recorded, their perpetrators shielded by wealth, status, or sheer cunning. The lack of answers left gaps in the stories, gaps that imagination and fear quickly filled. But what gave such stories weight were the fragments of truth hidden within them. In the medieval mindset, when something tragic or inexplicable happened, people sought explanations that matched the gravity of their loss. A missing child, a murdered noble, a string of unexplained disappearances. These were not brushed aside as coincidences. Instead, they became evidence of dark forces at play. Sometimes those dark forces were seen as supernatural, demons, curses, or witchcraft. Other times they were pinned on individuals who stood out from society in ways that made them easy targets for suspicion. The solitary hermit, the traveler with a strange accent, the woman who lived without a husband. Anyone who seemed different could quickly find themselves at the center of whispered accusations. And if fear spread fast enough, a legend was born. Yet among all the half-truths in folklore, we cannot forget that real killers did exist. Medieval Europe was not free from cruelty, and when people lived in close quarters with little oversight, violence often went unchecked. One chilling detail, repeated in different regions, was the idea of killers hiding in plain sight, blending into community life while secretly feeding their darker instincts. This duality, a trusted face by day, a monster by night, was perhaps the most terrifying possibility of all. People could defend themselves from wolves or bandits on the road, but how could they defend themselves from someone who shared their table, their prayers, their lives? That question lingers like a shadow across many of the medieval accounts, leaving us unsettled even centuries later. The records that survive are scattered, written down by monks, chroniclers, and local officials who often mixed fact with superstition. Some of these accounts speak of figures who used power and authority not to protect their people, but to prey upon them. Others describe wandering strangers who moved from place to place, leaving destruction behind, but never staying long enough to be caught. These writings do not always align perfectly with one another, but their common themes, the sudden disappearances, the unexplained deaths, the fear of nightfall, suggest a pattern too strong to ignore. Whether real killers or legends grown out of fear, these figures left scars on the collective memory of medieval society. And the chilling part is that their names were often lost, but their reputations endured. People didn't need exact details to feel fear. They didn't need to know the full truth to understand that somewhere, out there, danger was waiting. A candle could be blown out by the wind. A knock on the door could come from a stranger. And in that fragile moment, the balance between ordinary life and terror could collapse. This was the reality of medieval nights, where even the comfort of walls could not always keep danger away. Still, what fascinates us today is not only the crimes themselves, but how they were perceived by the people who lived through them. These stories reveal the human heart, its fears, its suspicions, and its desperate need to make sense of tragedy. In the face of loss, people clung to explanations, even if those explanations grew darker than reality itself. And so the tales of killers in medieval times became more than just accounts of violence. They became mirrors of the human condition, reflecting the anxieties of societies where life was short, uncertain, and precious. As we continue deeper into this world, one truth becomes clear. Not all of these stories ended neatly. Some killers were caught, others vanished without a trace, and many were never truly identified at all. That lack of closure left behind a lasting unease, one that can still be felt when we read their stories today. The unanswered questions linger, like footsteps echoing in a darkened alley. Who was truly responsible? Were these killers singular figures, or were the stories magnified by fear until they grew larger than life? Were some of them even real, or were they creations of a society trying to give shape to the darkness it felt pressing in from all sides? The answers may never be clear, but perhaps the uncertainty is what keeps us returning to these stories centuries later. For in their mystery, we find a reflection of our own fears. Our fear of the unknown, our fear of betrayal, our fear of the ordinary turning suddenly extraordinary in the most terrifying way. And while the names may fade and the details blur, the haunting presence of these medieval killers remains, just out of reach, reminding us that sometimes the most unsettling threats are the ones we can never fully explain. And so, the question grows heavier. Who were these people really, and what drove them to cross the fragile line between life and death, safety and terror? The deeper we search, the more the shadows close in, and the less certain we become of where the truth truly lies. To truly understand the fear that spread in medieval times, we have to step into the villages, towns, and castles where these stories were born. Imagine walking down a cobblestone street at dusk, the sky dimming to shades of purple and black, with the sound of hooves echoing in the distance. Candles flicker weakly in windows, and the air smells of wood smoke and damp stone. It was a world where daylight meant relative safety, but nightfall opened the door to everything unknown. People clung to their routines, locking shutters, gathering families close, and whispering prayers before bed. Yet even with such rituals, unease lingered. The fear wasn't just of thieves or wild animals, but of human beings, people who seemed to live under the same rules yet ignored them entirely. That was the most frightening thought of all. One of the most unsettling aspects of medieval life was the way rumors grew into truths. If a child disappeared, whispers began. If livestock was found butchered in strange ways, the murmurs deepened. Soon, people claimed to know of a figure lurking in the night, someone whose face they almost recognized, but never clearly. A neighbor might swear they saw a cloaked man near the fields. Another might insist they heard strange noises from the forest, and suddenly the village had a new story. A killer walked among them. Whether the details were true or not mattered little, because fear had already taken root. Fear gave shape to shadows, and those shadows became killers in people's minds. Yet some stories were harder to dismiss. Take, for example, the account from small hamlets in France during the late Middle Ages. Chroniclers wrote of entire families vanishing after welcoming traveling merchants into their homes. Nothing was left behind except overturned tables, scattered food, and sometimes bloodstains that never seemed to wash away. The merchants were never found, but strange goods began to appear in markets miles away. Goods that suspiciously resembled the belongings of the missing families. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or embroidered over time, they reveal how strongly people believed in the existence of predators disguised as ordinary folk. In England, another tale grew from whispers into legend. There were stories of a band of killers who lived hidden in caves, preying on travelers who strayed too far from the safety of towns. While this may sound like something straight out of folklore, the idea terrified medieval communities. Roads were already dangerous, filled with robbers and bandits. But the thought of an organized group that hunted for more than just coin-struck fear into everyone who heard the tale. It wasn't just about losing money or goods. It was about the fear of vanishing without a trace, of being erased from the world with no one to tell your story. What makes these accounts so compelling is how much they reveal about the human heart. People in the Middle Ages longed for explanations. When something horrific happened, when death struck too close to home, they searched for reasons. And if those reasons couldn't be found in ordinary accidents or illnesses, they turned to darker possibilities. They imagined figures who thrived on cruelty, who lived outside the laws of God and man. Whether these killers were real individuals or the products of a fearful imagination, their stories became warnings. Don't wander alone at night. Don't trust strangers too quickly. Don't forget how fragile life can be. But not every figure remained hidden in shadows. Some were named and recorded, their actions preserved in the writings of monks or local officials. These accounts, while rare, give us glimpses into the darker side of medieval humanity. They tell of nobles who abused their power, targeting those too poor to fight back. They tell of wanderers who moved from town to town, leaving a trail of fear in their wake. They tell of killers whose motives remain a mystery even centuries later. These records may not always align with modern standards of truth, but they show us how deeply the fear of human cruelty ran through medieval society. The danger wasn't limited to back roads or distant villages either. Even within castle walls, where knights and lords ruled with authority, stories of betrayal and hidden cruelty circulated. Servants whispered of masters with dark appetites, of sudden deaths that were quietly explained away, and of chambers no one dared enter after sundown. For those at the bottom of the social ladder, life depended on the whims of those above them, and when those whims turned cruel, justice was rarely served. These stories remind us that killers in medieval times were not always strangers in the dark. They could be the very people meant to protect their communities. All of this created a society where trust was fragile. The bonds between neighbors were strong because they had to be, but suspicion was never far away. People kept their eyes open, watching for signs that something wasn't right. A missing sheep could spark rumors of a lurking predator. A traveler who asked too many questions might be seen as dangerous. A widow who lived alone might be accused of harboring secrets. Fear blurred the line between truth and legend, but the effect was the same. It kept people awake at night, listening for every sound, wondering if danger was closer than they dared to believe. And what lingers most about these stories is not the gore or the cruelty, but the uncertainty. Who were these figures, really? How many of them were flesh and blood? And how many were creations of frightened minds? Were the whispers of cave-dwelling killers based on real events? Or were they warnings meant to keep travelers cautious? Did the vanishing families fall victim to predators? Or were their tragedies woven into darker legends to explain the unexplainable? The answers are lost to time, buried in the same silence that swallowed so many voices centuries ago. Yet, even without clear answers, the stories endure. They echo through history, shaping our understanding of how people lived and feared in the medieval world. They remind us that behind the great battles and royal courts, behind the castles and cathedrals, ordinary people lived with extraordinary fears. They remind us that the human fascination with killers is not new. It stretches back centuries, born from the same mixture of curiosity and dread that still draws us to these stories today. And so, we're left with more questions than answers. Who really walked those darkened roads? Who really knocked on those doors under cover of night? Were these killers lone figures acting in secret, Or were they part of something larger, something more organized, something even more terrifying? The chronicles fall silent just when the story grows darkest, leaving us staring into the same shadows that terrified our ancestors. And it is in those shadows that the next part of this journey lies waiting, with truths we are still not sure we are ready to face. As the stories of medieval killers spread, so too did the unease they created. The main conflict was not simply about crime or cruelty. It was about the fragile balance between fear and survival, trust and betrayal. People lived in a world where they depended on one another for safety, yet they could never be entirely sure if the very person they leaned on was the one who might turn against them. This tension ran like a quiet undercurrent through daily life, shaping how people thought, prayed, and even dreamed. It was not just the terror of the act itself that haunted them, but the uncertainty of who could be capable of such darkness. In many villages, the conflict played out through suspicion. If livestock went missing or children disappeared, neighbors looked first at one another. The widow at the edge of the field, the foreign merchant who passed through, the laborer who preferred solitude. All of them became easy targets for whispered blame. Sometimes those whispers escalated into open accusations, and accusations could spiral into punishments without evidence. The fear of killers didn't just create legends. It fractured communities, setting people against each other when unity was most needed. This was a conflict as old as humanity itself. The struggle to protect oneself without destroying the trust that held societies together. But the conflict wasn't only among villagers. Those who held power, the local lords, sheriffs, and even the church, faced a growing problem of their own. If they dismissed the stories of killers, they risked appearing blind to the fears of their people. If they took the stories too seriously, they risked fueling panic. This tension made leaders cautious, often responding with vague promises of safety while quietly wondering how much of what they heard was truth and how much was rumor. In some cases, they sent men into the forest to hunt for these so-called killers, but the woods remained silent, yielding no answers. The lack of resolution only deepened the sense that something sinister lingered just out of sight. From another angle, we can see how these fears created opportunities for those who wished to exploit them. In certain towns, bandits and thieves took advantage of the legends, disguising their robberies as the work of more sinister forces. By spreading whispers of the killer in the woods or the monster in the caves, they shifted suspicion away from themselves, allowing fear itself to cover their crimes. In this way, the conflict expanded beyond a single killer or group of killers. It became a battle between truth and deception, between what was real and what was imagined. And the more people doubted their own neighbors, the more power these unseen figures gained. One of the subplots that emerged in this conflict was the way superstition wove itself into daily life. Families placed charms above their doors, believing it would ward off intruders with dark intent. Priests reminded their congregations to stay close to God, warning that straying from faith made them vulnerable not only to spiritual harm, but also to physical danger. Every unexplained tragedy was tied to a larger narrative of good and evil, where killers were not just lawbreakers, but almost symbols of chaos itself. This spiritual dimension deepened the conflict, for it made people feel as though they were fighting something bigger than flesh and blood. There were also those who resisted the fear. Some storytellers and travelers openly questioned the legends, suggesting that they were exaggerated or invented to control people's behavior. Yet their voices were rarely the loudest, and sometimes they themselves became suspects simply for speaking differently. The subplot of these skeptics reveals another layer of the medieval conflict: the struggle between reason and fear, between rational explanation and the power of collective imagination. In a time when knowledge was limited and records scarce, it was often fear that won. Still, we cannot ignore the chilling possibility that some of these killers were real, moving unseen through the chaos of medieval life. Chroniclers wrote of travelers who disappeared on certain roads, of villagers who vanished after welcoming strangers, of sudden outbreaks of violence that no one could explain. Were these the works of ordinary bandits, or was there something darker threading through these stories? The chroniclers themselves rarely offered clear answers. They simply recorded what people believed, leaving behind accounts filled with tension but little resolution. And perhaps that is where the deepest conflict lies, not just in the acts themselves, but in the lack of certainty. People in medieval times longed for justice, for closure, for some kind of explanation that could allow them to move on. But often, that closure never came. The killers, real or imagined, remained unnamed, their crimes unsolved. That lingering silence created a wound that never fully healed, a shadow that remained even as generations passed. And in that silence, the stories grew, becoming larger than life until they belonged not just to one village or one family, but to the collective memory of entire regions. This unresolved conflict continues to echo even now, because it touches something universal. We too know the fear of the unknown, the anxiety of trusting the wrong person, the unease of not having answers when tragedy strikes. The medieval stories remind us that this conflict is not bound to one time or place. It is part of what it means to be human. And in telling these stories, we see how our ancestors wrestled with the same questions we still ask today. Who can we trust? How much of what we fear is real? And what do we do when the truth remains just out of reach? As the shadows lengthened over medieval towns and villages, the stories grew darker. Families gathered closer, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and leaders tried to hold together communities trembling with fear. But still the conflict deepened, unresolved, with no clear answers in sight. And somewhere, out on the dark roads and in the hushed corners of castles, figures moved unseen, their names lost to history, but their presence lingering in every whispered tale that has survived. The tension remains, building with each unanswered question, waiting for the moment when the silence will finally break. The stories that survive in scattered chronicles and whispers across medieval Europe begin to give faces, however blurred, to the fears that people carried with them. Each tale is incomplete, filled with gaps and contradictions, but those gaps only seem to add to the tension. They are like fragments of broken glass, sharp on their own, but together they reflect something larger and far more unsettling. If we lean in closer to these fragments, we begin to glimpse the figures who haunted the medieval imagination, figures who became both symbols of human cruelty and cautionary lessons for those who came after. One such story is said to have unfolded in the rural heartlands of Germany, where travelers spoke of a solitary innkeeper who welcomed strangers with a smile and a warm fire. At first glance, his home was a place of comfort, a rare haven on the long and dangerous roads. But according to stories passed down, not every traveler who entered left again. Some vanished into silence, their belongings resurfacing days later in nearby towns, sold by hands that claimed not to know their origin. No official records exist to confirm the man's guilt, yet the tale took on a life of its own. Parents told their children never to trust too easily, never to rest too soundly under the roof of someone they didn't know. Whether the innkeeper was real or an invention, his story became part of the conflict. An example of how hospitality, a sacred bond in medieval society, could be twisted into a weapon of betrayal. In France, another legend spread about a group of travelers who moved together through the countryside. They posed as merchants, carrying goods and offering trades, but wherever they went, disappearances followed. Some said they were not merchants at all, but organized thieves who lived by feeding off those who trusted them. Others believed they were far worse, not just stealing, but taking lives as well. What frightened people most was the idea that these killers were not lurking in caves or hidden forests, but walking openly among them, blending into marketplaces and fairs. In a society built on trade and exchange, the idea that strangers with friendly smiles could harbor deadly intent deepened the conflict between trust and fear. Further north, in the British Isles, a different kind of story was whispered across campfires. It was said that entire families had vanished while traveling through remote regions, their wagons discovered abandoned on the roadside, with no signs of struggle. The explanations varied. Some believed bandits were to blame. Others whispered of a clan that lived off the flesh of travelers, hiding their crimes in the caves of the coast. The more the story spread, the darker it grew, until it became almost impossible to separate truth from fear. What matters more than its accuracy is how it captured the anxieties of a people who often traveled long distances on isolated paths. In a world without maps or steady protection, the unknown was not just frightening, it was potentially deadly. Another angle of this conflict appears in the accounts of those within the walls of power. Chronicles tell of nobles accused of cruelty, using their authority to harm rather than protect. These were figures who did not need shadows or disguises. Their power shielded them. For ordinary people, this was perhaps the most terrifying reality of all, that killers could exist openly above the law and face no punishment. It reveals a subplot that often gets overlooked. While villagers feared the stranger on the road, they also feared those who ruled over them. The killer might not be a wandering figure in the woods at all. It might be the very person who commanded obedience in the daylight. From the perspective of the church, the stories of killers became bound up with ideas of sin and punishment. Priests often framed these figures as warnings of what happened when men and women strayed from God's path. Some chroniclers even described such killers as instruments of the devil, their actions seen as proof of evil's presence in the world. This interpretation did more than offer spiritual explanations. It also reinforced the daily fear that darkness was never far away, not only in forests and alleys, but within human hearts themselves. The subplot of spiritual struggle deepened the main conflict, casting every unexplained disappearance or violent act as part of a larger war between good and evil. Yet despite the weight of these fears, there were also stories of resilience. Villages sometimes banded together, watching over the roads and keeping torches lit late into the night. Neighbors took turns guarding their flocks and families, creating bonds of trust that stood in defiance of suspicion. But even in these moments of unity, the shadows loomed. People could never be entirely sure if their caution was enough, or if the danger was closer than they dared believe. The killers, or the legends of them, still hung over their lives like a storm that would not pass. What makes these tales so haunting is the lack of resolution. We rarely know what truly happened, who was guilty, or how justice was served, if at all. The stories simply trail off, leaving gaps where certainty should be. A family vanishes. A traveler disappears. A nobleman is accused but never punished. And then silence. The silence itself becomes part of the terror, because it leaves space for imagination to take hold. And imagination, fueled by fear, often paints the darkest picture possible. The conflict, then, was never just about the killers themselves. It was about the human struggle to live with uncertainty, to seek safety in a world where safety could never be guaranteed. It was about the constant push and pull between trust and suspicion, between hospitality and self-protection, between community and isolation. Each story, whether true or shaped by fear, added to this struggle, creating a world where every knock on the door, every unfamiliar face, carried the weight of possibility. Even now, centuries later, these stories still unsettle us. They remind us that history is not just about kings and battles, but about ordinary people grappling with fears that never fully go away. The names of the killers may be lost, but the questions remain. Who were they really? How many of the legends were true? And if we were there, walking those roads, sitting in those dimly lit inns, would we have been able to tell the difference between a friend and a predator? The deeper we dig into these medieval accounts, the clearer it becomes that the conflict is unresolved, stretching across time and memory like a shadow that refuses to fade. And in that shadow lies the heart of the story, a heart that beats with both fear and fascination, waiting for us to step closer, though never quite close enough to touch the truth. The deeper we go into these tales, the more it feels as though each region of medieval Europe held its own secret shadows. The fear of killers was not confined to one village or one kingdom. It was like a thread woven across the entire fabric of medieval life. Yet the thread took on different colors and shapes depending on where the stories came from, giving us not one tale, but many subplots, each adding weight to the larger conflict of fear, trust, and survival. In France, for example, the fear often lingered along the countryside roads where merchants and pilgrims traveled. These paths were lifelines for trade and faith, but they were also dangerous corridors where travelers were at their most vulnerable. Some accounts tell of bands of men posing as guides or offering help to weary strangers. By day they seemed harmless, but by night their intentions changed. What unsettled people most was not only the violence itself, but the trickery, offering a hand of friendship before turning it into betrayal. For French villagers who relied heavily on the arrival of merchants for their survival, this conflict was personal. Every new stranger brought the possibility of both prosperity and doom. In England, the stories leaned more toward hidden killers who blended into the community itself. Some chroniclers wrote of men who lived ordinary lives during the day, farmers, butchers, or millers, yet were whispered to take lives under cover of night. These figures were rarely caught, and when they were accused, the accusations often dissolved into uncertainty. Did they really commit such crimes, or had fear simply painted them as monsters? The lack of evidence did not ease the tension. Instead, it made suspicion spread wider, creating invisible walls between neighbors. In such a small and tightly knit society, the idea that the killer could be sitting beside you in church on Sunday morning was perhaps the most terrifying possibility of all. Germany carried its own legends, many of them connected to the dense forest that stretched endlessly across its landscape. The woods were both a source of life and a place of dread. They provided firewood, game, and herbs, yet they also swallowed travelers whole. Stories spread of figures who lived in isolation within the forest, watching the roads and waiting for those who traveled alone. Some said these figures were not individuals at all, but entire families who had turned their backs on society, surviving by preying on others. Whether true or not, the stories captured the imagination of the people, feeding into the larger conflict of man versus wilderness, safety versus the unknown. The German forests became more than just places of nature. They became symbols of danger itself. Italy added yet another perspective. In its bustling cities, the fear was not of isolated killers hiding in caves or woods, but of corruption in plain sight. The narrow streets of Florence, Venice, or Rome were alive with commerce, art, and politics, but they were also places where power could be abused without question. Some records speak of powerful families accused of silencing their rivals through means far darker than politics. Others tell of ordinary citizens who vanished, their disappearances explained away too easily. In a world where authority was deeply entangled with wealth, the idea that killers could hide behind influence created a different kind of terror. For Italians, the question was not just who could be trusted, but whether justice itself could ever be trusted at all. As these subplots unfolded across Europe, the common thread was not simply the presence of killers, but the uncertainty surrounding them. No one ever knew for certain who they were, how many there might be, or whether the stories were entirely true. Yet this uncertainty only made the fear stronger. People filled the gaps with their own imagination, and the imagination often painted the darkest possible picture. The killers, whether real or legendary, became symbols of everything fragile in human life. The suddenness of loss, the betrayal of trust, the thin line between normalcy and terror. From the perspective of the church, these stories carried heavy moral weight. Priests often preached about them as warnings of sin, painting the killers as living examples of what happened when humanity strayed too far from God. They reminded their congregations that while bandits and killers might harm the body, straying from faith could destroy the soul. This religious framing gave the conflict a deeper layer. The killers were not just individuals committing crimes. They were symbols of evil itself, reminders of the constant struggle between good and darkness in everyday life. Meanwhile, storytellers and travelers carried these tales from one village to another, giving them new life in every retelling. Each time a story was shared, details shifted and grew, turning the killers into larger-than-life figures. One man became a band of outlaws. A hidden cave became a sprawling network of underground lairs. A disappearance became a massacre. These embellishments might not have reflected reality, but they reflected fear, and fear has always had a way of spreading faster than truth. The storytellers may not have known it, but in weaving these tales, they were also weaving the very fabric of the conflict, ensuring that the tension never died but grew with each retelling. And for the people who lived in these times, that tension was more than just a story. It shaped how they lived. It influenced when they traveled, who they trusted, and how closely they watched their neighbors. It meant that children were warned from a young age to be cautious, to stay close, to never accept kindness without suspicion. It meant that every flicker of movement in the dark could be imagined as a predator, every silence on the road as a trap. The killers, whether they existed exactly as described or not, had already succeeded in shaping the minds and behaviors of entire societies. Yet, despite all the fear and suspicion, the killers remained elusive. The stories end without clear answers, leaving behind only silence and speculation. Were these men and women real, people who went uncaught? Were they exaggerated criminals whose deeds grew monstrous with every telling? Or were some of them merely shadows born from fear itself, given names and shapes so people could make sense of their losses? The truth is hidden somewhere in the folds of time, and perhaps we are not meant to know it fully. Still, the tension lingers in every unanswered question. Who really walked those roads at night? Who sat in the quiet corner of an inn, waiting for the right moment to strike? Who smiled in daylight and hid darkness after sunset? The chronicles grow vague just when the stories grow darkest, leaving us staring into the same shadows that haunted our ancestors. The killers of medieval times, real or imagined, remain just out of reach, their names forgotten, but their presence alive in the fears they left behind. The stories of fear in the Middle Ages were not told only through old records or the sermons of priests. They were lived every day in the hearts of ordinary people. To really understand the weight of these tales, we have to step closer into the small, human details, the quiet lives interrupted by rumors, the daily routines shadowed by whispers of killers who might be near. Each perspective adds depth to the conflict, because behind every legend was someone who believed it, someone who feared it, and someone who might have suffered from it. Take, for example, a simple villager. Imagine a man who worked the fields from dawn to dusk, his back bent under the weight of the soil he tilled. His life was already heavy with hardship, yet what kept him awake at night was not the hunger in his belly, but the thought of what lurked beyond the tree line. He might have heard stories of travelers disappearing not far from his village. He might have walked home one evening and thought he saw movement in the brush. Was it a wolf? Or was it something worse? Someone waiting to do him harm? These quiet moments of dread were not rare. They were constant companions. For villagers like him, the killers were not just a tale. They were part of the landscape, as real as the rain and the cold. For travelers, the fear was even sharper. Merchants, pilgrims, wandering monks, they all knew the danger of the road. A journey of only a few miles could feel like a gamble with fate. A merchant carrying goods might glance behind him at every sound, clutching the sack on his cart as though it were a shield. A pilgrim, walking alone to a holy shrine, might pray with every step that the stories of killers were just exaggerations. Yet when night fell and the fire burned low, the sound of leaves moving in the wind could tighten the chest with fear. Every crack of a branch could mean someone was watching. Nobles, too, were not free of these fears, though their worries often took a different form. They had walls, guards, and resources, but even castles could not silence the rumors that killers roamed the land. A noblewoman might hear of disappearances on the road and forbid her children from leaving the gates. A lord might double the number of armed escorts on his journeys, not knowing if the killers were peasants desperate for survival or organized groups with darker motives. What haunted nobles most was the idea that killers did not respect rank or wealth. They might attack a farmer or a traveler, but they could also reach into the carriages of the powerful. The priests of the church, meanwhile, looked at the problem through another lens. To them, the killers were proof of humanity's fallen nature. They preached that the world was full of temptations, that evil could take root in anyone's heart. Some priests warned that killers were not just men, but servants of darker forces, testing the faithful. In the sermons, killers were symbols of sin that had grown too strong, the embodiment of a soul consumed by greed or rage. For ordinary people listening in pews, these words made the killers feel less human and more like shadows of evil itself. Figures who could not be reasoned with, only feared. Even children were not untouched by these stories. Parents told them cautionary tales at night, urging them not to wander too far, not to trust strangers, not to take kindness without question. For the children, the killers became like monsters in the woods, half real, half imagined. Yet the warnings worked. Generations grew up cautious, always watching the corners of the road, always carrying the memory of stories whispered at bedtime. What makes these perspectives so powerful is that they show how fear itself became a character in medieval life. It was not only about the killers who may have existed, but about the way people reacted to the possibility of them. Fear built invisible walls. It turned neighbors into suspects, strangers into threats, forests into prisons. The killers might have taken some lives, but the fear of them shaped millions more. And yet, in every one of these human stories, the conflict deepened rather than found resolution. The villager still saw shadows in the forest. The traveler still glanced behind with every step. The noble still reinforced his guards. The priest still warned of sin. And the children still whispered the stories to one another in the dark. No one knew where the truth ended and the legend began. No one could say how many killers there were, or if some were simply creations of imagination. The lack of certainty only made the story stronger. The silence of the records, the gaps in the chronicles, almost feel intentional, as if history itself wanted to leave us in suspense. Were there really men hiding in the woods, waiting for travelers? Were there really families who turned their lives to crime, preying on others to survive? Or did the darkness of the medieval world, with its hunger, sickness, and wars, simply need a face to blame? These unanswered questions make the conflict timeless. It was not just about killers. It was about how societies struggled with fear and the unknown. And as we listen to these stories today, the tension still lingers. We may not walk medieval roads, but the unease they felt, the suspicion of strangers, the worry of hidden dangers, is something that still echoes in our own time. That is why the stories endure, why the shadows of medieval killers still haunt us. They are reminders that fear itself never truly disappears. It only changes shape. But what makes these tales most chilling is not only what was said, but what was left unsaid. In village records, there are sudden silences, names of missing people, unexplained disappearances, entries cut short with no answers given. In sermons, there are warnings with no clear examples, as if the priests were too afraid to speak openly. In travelers' notes, there are half-finished lines, cut off as though the writer could not bring themselves to describe what they saw. These silences are louder than words. They suggest that something darker lingered in the shadows, something too heavy to be spoken outright. And so the conflict remains unresolved. Were the killers individuals, gangs, or merely inventions of fear? Were they isolated tales or part of a hidden pattern across Europe? The further we search, the more the lines blur, and the closer we get to the heart of the mystery. As the whispers spread and the years passed, the tales of killers in medieval times grew heavier, almost unbearable. It was no longer just a matter of scattered rumors or warnings from priests. It became something that clung to daily life like a shadow that would not let go. People spoke of the stories in hushed tones, as though saying them too loudly might bring the figures themselves to the door. Each tale seemed to build upon the last, adding more fear, more tension, more uncertainty. And, slowly, the question shifted from whether the killers existed to where they might strike next. The tension reached its height when entire communities began to believe that patterns were forming. In some regions, disappearances seemed too frequent, too similar to ignore. Travelers vanished along the same stretch of road. Children went missing near the same forest clearing. Farmers swore they saw strange fires flickering in the distance, always in the same place, always too late at night to be innocent. The patterns wove together like threads, and soon the stories were no longer just whispers of individual danger. They felt like a gathering storm. People began to sense that something larger was at play. Some believed there was not one killer, but many, working together in secret. Others thought the killers were connected to dark cults, hidden in the countryside, performing rituals that no one dared to describe in detail. Still others suspected that the killers were not outlaws at all, but people of standing, lords, priests, merchants, using their power to hide their crimes. The lack of answers meant every theory could thrive, and every theory was frightening. Suspicion spread like wildfire, and soon even families looked inward with unease. Who could be trusted? Who might be hiding the darkest of secrets? The roads grew emptier as fear overtook necessity. Merchants traveled in larger groups, with armed escorts who barely slept during the night. Pilgrims delayed their journeys, praying that waiting a few months might mean safer roads. Villagers refused to wander into the woods, even for firewood, even if it meant colder nights. Fear reshaped the rhythm of life, drawing invisible lines that no one dared to cross. And then there were the silences, the gaps in records, the unfinished stories, the sudden endings that only deepened the mystery. A chronicler might begin to describe a disappearance, and then leave the account incomplete. A priest might warn of evil, but fall quiet when pressed for details. A traveler's diary might end mid-sentence, the ink trailing off as if something had interrupted them. These silences became their own kind of evidence, stronger than words, suggesting that something too terrible to record lingered just beyond reach. As rumors of organized killers grew, so did the fear that no one was safe. In one region, a family left their home behind after hearing screams on the road one night, never to return. In another, a monastery locked its gates for weeks, refusing travelers entry even if they claimed to be pilgrims. Villages posted guards at night, though the guards themselves were often too afraid to patrol beyond the torchlight. Fear had turned communities inward, creating small islands of isolation across the land. But the tension did not stop there. Soon, strange coincidences began to feel like warnings. Fires that destroyed barns were said to be signals. Discarded clothing found near rivers was thought to belong to missing travelers. Even the natural howls of wolves at night took on new meaning, as though nature itself was trying to announce danger. The world felt alive with signs, and every sign pointed toward something darker approaching. The most unsettling part was the uncertainty of numbers. Was there one killer, 10, or an entire network? The stories conflicted. Some spoke of lone figures slipping into villages under cover of night. Others swore they saw groups moving together, silent and coordinated. The lack of clarity only tightened the suspense. It felt as though an unseen hand was always just beyond reach, always moving, always waiting. And then came the accounts of survivors, rare but enough to deepen the fear. A merchant who claimed he escaped an ambush by hiding in the brush. A young boy who returned to his village after being missing for days but refused to speak of what had happened. A traveler who stumbled into an inn with torn clothing, saying only that he had seen faces in the dark that were not human. These accounts never carried details that could be confirmed, yet they were believable enough to spread like fire. They gave the killers shape, but never form. They gave them presence, but never identity. Every passing season seemed to heighten the tension. Winter brought longer nights, where every shadow stretched further than comfort allowed. Spring brought travelers back to the roads, only for whispers of new vanishings to follow. Summer, with its festivals and gatherings, was filled with cautious laughter, for no one dared celebrate too loudly while shadows lurked. And autumn, with its harvest, reminded people how fragile survival was, how easily it could be cut short by something unseen. By this point, the fear of killers had grown so heavy that it no longer mattered whether the stories were fully true or half imagined. The killers had become more than individuals. They had become the embodiment of dread itself. They were the reason villagers locked their doors early, why travelers clutched their belongings tightly, why nobles doubled their guards. They were the reason priests preached more fiercely, storytellers whispered more urgently, and children lay awake at night, listening for sounds that might not have been there at all. The suspense pressed on like a tightening grip, unrelenting, almost unbearable. Everyone felt it. Something was coming. Something larger than the stories themselves, something that might finally show whether the killers were real or whether fear had created its own monsters. The air grew heavy with anticipation, as though all of medieval Europe was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the shadows would reveal themselves. But that moment never came, at least not yet. Instead, the stories pause in silence. The tension stretched to its breaking point, leaving us on the edge of the unknown. What lies in that silence? Were the killers truly among them, watching, waiting? Or had fear itself become the deadliest force of all? The silence before the storm seemed endless, and yet it was in that silence that the fear of medieval killers became unbearable. Villages trembled under whispers. Merchants tightened their grip on their coin purses, and travelers dared not rest without one eye open. The tension was like a drawn bowstring, pulled tighter and tighter, waiting for the moment it would snap. People sensed that the shadows were not content to linger forever. Something was about to happen, and when it did, it would shake their fragile sense of safety to the core. The climax of these stories began with a series of strange nights, when the familiar rhythm of life broke apart. In one village, dogs howled for hours without reason, their cries piercing the air until even the bravest men grew pale. In another, travelers failed to arrive though their departure from the last town had been confirmed. The roads were searched, but nothing was found. No bodies, no broken carts, no signs of struggle. Only silence, heavy and unnatural. That silence was worse than any discovery, because it left the imagination free to create horrors greater than anything seen. In the cities, the tension grew in a different way. Rumors spread that killers walked among the people, disguised as laborers or merchants, slipping unnoticed through crowded markets. Every stolen glance became suspicious, every unfamiliar face a possible threat. Parents clutched their children tighter, and guards patrolled with nervous eyes. Yet, despite their presence, no one felt safer. The killers, whether real or imagined, seemed to move just beyond reach, always unseen, always ahead of the search. And then came the stories that shook entire regions. In France, travelers spoke of a place where the trees grew unnaturally close, their branches interlocking like a cage. Within those woods, they said, fires burned at night, and figures were seen moving in circles. A merchant swore he heard chanting in the distance, though he could not make out the words. He turned back, abandoning his journey, but his story spread quickly. Was it a gathering of killers, or something even darker? The uncertainty only made the tale more powerful. In Germany, the forests were already feared, but when hunters stumbled upon a clearing filled with abandoned belongings, shoes, clothing, a broken staff, fear deepened into panic. No one could explain why the items had been left or where their owners had gone. The hunters swore the clearing felt wrong, as though watched, as though the trees themselves held secrets. The story reached nearby villages, and suddenly no one dared venture into the woods. Fires burned higher at night, as if more light might hold the shadows at bay. Italy carried its own climax in whispered accusations that killers had infiltrated the very circles of power. A noble was found dead under mysterious circumstances, and while the official word spoke of illness, servants whispered otherwise. They claimed he had been silenced, that he had discovered too much about hidden networks in the city. Whether true or not, the suspicion spread. If even nobles could fall, what protection did ordinary people have? Trust unraveled, not only between villagers and strangers, but within the very courts of power. The most chilling accounts came from survivors, rare voices that fueled the climax of the legend. A farmer's wife claimed she had been followed for miles by footsteps that stopped whenever she turned. A traveler arrived at an inn breathless, swearing he had seen figures crouched low by the roadside, watching him without moving. And one boy, missing for days before stumbling back into his village, refused to speak of what he had seen. He only shook his head, his eyes wide with terror, as though words themselves might summon the shadows back. These fragments of survival created more fear than certainty ever could. The conflict reached a breaking point when entire communities began to act out of sheer desperation. Some villages dug ditches and raised barriers, not against armies, but against unseen killers. Others set traps in the woods, hoping to catch what lurked there, though nothing ever came. Nobles hired more guards, monasteries locked their gates, and priests preached of repentance more urgently than ever. Yet for all the effort, the killers, or the fear of them, remained untouched, always stronger than the defenses built against them. What made this climax unbearable was the sense that danger was everywhere and nowhere at once. A villager could vanish while gathering wood. A traveler could disappear on the road without a sound. A noble could fall in his own guarded home. And yet, when people searched for answers, they found nothing but silence and shadows. No proof, no names, no faces, only fear feeding upon itself, growing larger than life. The killers, whether real or born of imagination, had become an unstoppable force. It was during this time that stories began to take on a sharper edge, mixing reality with legend. Some said the killers were part of hidden brotherhoods, bound together by secret oaths. Others claimed they were wanderers cursed by God, doomed to bring ruin wherever they went. Still others whispered that entire families had devoted themselves to the practice, passing it down from parent to child. Each story was darker than the last, and none could be proven or disproven. The lack of answers gave the killers a power stronger than any weapon, the power of imagination. The suspense was almost too much for people to bear. Every night was filled with the expectation of screams that never came. Every road seemed ready to reveal a trap that never appeared. Every shadow felt like the edge of a revelation that stayed just out of reach. The killers had become the embodiment of dread, the climax of fear itself. And then, just when it felt as though the tension could stretch no further, there were reports of something new, something larger than whispers, larger than rumors, something that suggested the killers were not only real, but closer than anyone dared believe. Travelers swore of whole groups vanishing without trace, not one or two, but dozens. Villages spoke of lights in the woods, of fires that burned for nights on end. Priests wrote letters warning of evil that could not be named, sealed with urgency. And though no one had proof, everyone believed the same thing. The climax had arrived. The shadows were no longer at the edges. They were here, pressing close, waiting for the final reveal. But that reveal never came, at least not yet. The story stopped just as the suspense becomes unbearable, leaving us with nothing but silence, unanswered questions, and a sense that the truth was too heavy to be recorded. The killers of medieval times remained hidden, their secrets unresolved, their presence felt but never proven. And in that silence, the tension lingers, holding us on the edge of the unknown, waiting for the moment when the shadows will finally speak. Just when it seemed as though the tension had reached its highest point, another layer of mystery began to unfold, one that no one had expected. The whispers of killers in medieval times were terrifying enough, but what unsettled people even more was the growing belief that these figures were not acting alone. There were rumors of something bigger, something hidden behind the curtain of fear that stretched across Europe. It was as if the killers were not isolated shadows at all, but part of a network, a web of darkness woven into the very fabric of medieval life. At first, these ideas seemed like the product of frightened minds. But then small details began to surface that could not easily be ignored. Villages hundreds of miles apart described the same patterns. Fires burning deep in the woods, disappearances along certain roads, strange symbols carved into trees or stones near where people had gone missing. These marks were simple, crosses, circles, or lines, but they appeared too often to be coincidence. The thought that the killers might be connected across vast distances sent fear spiraling higher. If they were organized, then no place was truly safe. Priests began to take notice, and some went so far as to suggest that this was not only the work of men, but a coordinated rebellion against the order of God. They wrote of hidden brotherhoods, secret gatherings in the forests, groups who bound themselves together in darkness. They warned that the killers were not just individuals consumed by sin, but part of something greater, something that thrived in silence and secrecy. Whether true or not, these warnings made the tension unbearable, for it suggested that the fear people had lived with for years was only a glimpse of something far larger. What shocked people most were the sudden disappearances of entire groups. Before, the fear had been of lone travelers or small families vanishing. But now, there were stories of whole bands of merchants, caravans that never reached their destinations, even processions of pilgrims who set out together and never returned. To lose one person could be dismissed as misfortune, but to lose dozens in a single journey shook the very ground of medieval society. Trade faltered, pilgrimages were abandoned, and villages that relied on outside goods fell into despair. And then came the letters, fragments of messages written by travelers who seemed to sense their danger. One spoke of being followed for days by silent figures who never revealed themselves. Another described seeing torches moving in the distance, far too many to belong to hunters or shepherds. The final line of one letter read, "They are not what we thought. They are many." The letter ended there, with no explanation, no signature, only silence. These letters, passed from hand to hand, became proof in the eyes of many that the killers were no longer isolated terrors, but part of something larger. The suspense deepened further when stories emerged of connections between the killers and people of influence. A merchant whispered that nobles themselves might be involved, providing protection for these groups in exchange for loyalty. A farmer claimed he overheard men in authority speaking of the disappearances as though they were not surprised by them. A monk wrote that some priests were suspiciously silent, refusing to condemn the killers with the same urgency as others. Whether true or imagined, these suspicions planted seeds of distrust in every corner of society. If those in power were protecting the killers, then who could be trusted at all? This was the second twist, the revelation that the killers might not be nameless shadows in the woods, but hidden figures intertwined with medieval life itself. The possibility that leaders, nobles, or even the church could be connected to the disappearances made the conflict more terrifying than before. It was no longer just about strangers on the road. It was about the very structure of society. The fear that the killers could be anyone, anywhere, grew unbearable. As these rumors spread, people began to see signs everywhere. A traveler who disappeared might have been taken by outlaws, or perhaps by something far worse. A noble who died suddenly might have been silenced because he knew too much. Fires seen in the distance might have been rituals, not accidents. Every unexplained event became another piece of evidence for the growing belief that medieval Europe was living under a hidden threat larger than anyone had dared imagine. This escalation of the conflict left people caught between two unbearable truths. If the killers were real, then they were far more powerful and organized than anyone thought. But if they were not real, if the stories were born of fear and suspicion, then that fear itself had become an invisible killer, shaping lives, destroying trust, and tearing communities apart. Either way, the world had changed. The fear had reached a level that could no longer be contained, and people lived every day on the edge of discovery or collapse. The silence in the records became more haunting at this stage. Gaps in chronicles grew wider, as though entire sections of truth had been deliberately erased. Letters ended without explanation. Travelers' notes stopped mid-journey. Even the sermons of priests fell quiet, filled with vague warnings instead of detail. It was as if those who knew the truth were too afraid to write it down, too afraid that by naming the killers, they would summon them. This left medieval Europe trapped in unbearable suspense. Were the killers truly part of an organized force, connected across kingdoms and protected by power? Or had the fear of them simply grown too large, consuming reason and replacing it with terror? The answer remained just out of reach, hidden in the same shadows that had haunted the people for centuries. And so the story pressed towards climax. The killers were no longer distant rumors. They were everywhere, on the roads, in the forests, perhaps even within the walls of castles and monasteries. Fear had become a constant companion, tightening around every life, every journey, every whispered prayer. People felt that something was coming, something larger than the scattered tales, something that would finally reveal whether the killers were shadows of men or shadows of fear itself. The tension had reached such a sharp edge that it was no longer a matter of whispers or rumors. Fear was now carved into daily life. Merchants who once filled the roads with carts stayed behind locked doors. Pilgrims who used to walk in singing groups of dozens now moved in silence, clutching their crosses, afraid to speak aloud. Even kings and nobles tightened their guards, surrounding themselves with soldiers, unsure whether the killers hid in the forests or within their own courts. It was a time when silence spoke louder than words, and every missing person, every unreturned traveler, became proof that something monstrous was pressing closer. The climax of this story began to take shape, not with a single event, but with a chain of them. One kingdom in particular became the center of attention when, within a single season, nearly 20 traders vanished on its borders. At first, people blamed robbers, but the merchants had traveled with guards, and those guards vanished too. In every case, wagons were left untouched, filled with goods, gold, and supplies. It was not wealth the killers wanted. It was people. That detail shocked everyone, because it changed the picture entirely. If these were robbers, they would have taken silver and cloth. But these killers took only lives. This revelation drew the church deeper into the conflict. Priests declared from their pulpits that Europe was not facing mere criminals, but a force of evil unlike anything before. Some called it demonic, others said it was heresy, but all agreed it was no longer just about survival on the roads. It was about the soul of Christendom itself. Processions were held. Prayers rose like smoke through every city, but the killings did not stop. Instead, they grew more frequent, as if mocking every prayer. The killers thrived in the silence that followed each hymn. Then, another twist. Reports emerged that in some villages, people began claiming they had seen the killers, not as shadows, not as faceless strangers, but as people they knew. A farmer insisted he saw his neighbor among the hooded figures who carried away a merchant. A shepherd swore that one of the killers spoke with the voice of his cousin. These accounts created chaos because they suggested the unthinkable, that the killers were not outsiders at all, but part of the same communities they terrorized. Friends, neighbors, even family could secretly belong to them. This rumor, whether true or not, poisoned the trust that still held medieval life together. Villagers turned on each other, accusing neighbors of keeping secrets. Trials erupted, not unlike witch trials of later centuries, where suspicion was enough to condemn a person. Some confessed under pressure, claiming they had indeed been part of hidden gatherings, drawn into secret oaths in the woods. Whether these confessions were true or made out of fear, no one knew. But their words only fed the terror. There was a brotherhood of killers, and it was growing. The scale of the threat suddenly seemed overwhelming. What began as isolated disappearances had now become a plague of suspicion stretching across Europe. Kings demanded answers. Priests begged for miracles. Villagers built barricades at night, setting watchmen at their gates. Yet the killings continued, methodical, almost as though the killers wanted to prove that no amount of caution could save anyone. By this point, it was no longer clear who was hunting whom. Travelers spoke of killers waiting on the roads, but there were also whispers that groups of villagers had begun hunting those they suspected of belonging to the Brotherhood. Fires burned in the night, sometimes from raids by killers, sometimes from mobs burning the homes of accused families. The fear had become a living creature, growing beyond control. The climax of the story sharpened when entire regions began to fracture under the weight of distrust. Nobles accused one another of sheltering killers. Priests accused nobles of hiding the truth. Families were divided, some fleeing to distant lands in search of safety, only to disappear themselves. The killers, whoever they truly were, had become more than a threat. They had become a mirror, reflecting the darkest fears of the age. People began to believe that the killers were no longer just men, but something greater, something almost supernatural, because how else could they be everywhere at once? The silence in the chronicles became unbearable at this point. Pages ended abruptly. Writers hinted at horrors they dared not describe. Some wrote of villages abandoned overnight, as if the killers had come like a wave and taken everyone. Others left behind only half-finished notes, as though they too were interrupted mid-sentence. Each gap in the record added to the mystery, fueling the belief that something larger was hidden behind the veil of time. And yet, the killers themselves remained unseen in any concrete form. That was their greatest weapon, absence. People could describe their shadows, their symbols, their whispers, but no one left a clear account of their faces or their motives. It was as though they wanted to remain myths, feeding on fear itself. And perhaps that was their truest power, not the lives they took, but the terror they left behind, terror so strong it broke families, villages, even kingdoms. The question that haunted everyone was simple. What did they want? If not gold, if not land, then why take only people? Some said they sacrificed them in secret rituals. Others believed they were building an underground army, a force of souls bound to them in death. The church claimed they were servants of the devil, harvesting souls for his kingdom. But no one could prove anything. All that was left were bodies, or sometimes not even that, just silence. This was where the story's climax pressed hardest. The killers were no longer merely feared travelers on lonely roads. They had become the embodiment of medieval terror itself, a force that lived in the mind as much as in the shadows. And every unanswered question, who they were, why they killed, whether they were human at all, only pulled the world closer to collapse. The suspense had risen to its highest point. Entire kingdoms felt as though they stood at the edge of something greater, something that could shatter the fragile balance of their world. Would the killers finally reveal themselves? Would their purpose be exposed? Or would the silence continue, leaving behind only fear, unanswered questions, and a haunting sense that medieval Europe was living under the shadow of an invisible empire of killers? The moment everyone had been waiting for finally came, not with trumpets or the cries of soldiers, but with a single night of silence that spread across the land like a storm. For weeks the killings had grown sharper, bolder, more relentless, until people began to think nothing could ever stop them. Then, one evening, when the moon was heavy and pale in the sky, an entire band of travelers set out with priests, guards, and villagers walking together, daring the killers to strike. And strike they did. Out of the trees came the figures cloaked in darkness, their torches glowing like eyes, their steps echoing through the forest. For the first time, the killers showed themselves in full view, no longer content with shadows and whispers. The villagers held their ground, clutching crosses and weapons, chanting prayers into the night. The priests raised relics, and soldiers braced for battle. What followed was chaos, but it was also revelation. When the cloaked figures tore away their hoods in the struggle, the truth froze everyone. They were not foreign invaders, not demons from another world, but people they recognized, farmers, bakers, even monks from nearby abbeys. Some were missing sons who had vanished years before. Others were noblemen's retainers, thought lost to war. These were not outsiders at all. They were their own people, reshaped by some hidden oath, bound to the brotherhood of killers that had haunted Europe for generations. The shock was unbearable. Mothers screamed as they recognized sons they thought dead. Villagers dropped weapons, torn between grief and fear. Even the killers themselves seemed almost unbroken, their eyes hollow but their faces familiar, as though some part of them still knew who they once had been. It became clear then that the killings had never been random violence. They had been recruitment. Those taken were not simply destroyed. They were remade, drawn into the Brotherhood, and sent back against the world that once sheltered them. The battle ended not with total victory, but with collapse. Enough of the killers were unmasked that the Brotherhood's secret was finally revealed. The spell of mystery was broken. Once their faces were seen, once their names were spoken aloud, their hold on Europe weakened. People realized they were not dealing with spirits, but with humans, terrifying, yes, but flesh and blood nonetheless. Guards and villagers pressed harder, hunting down those who tried to flee. The church declared them heretics, and kings, desperate to restore order, outlawed the Brotherhood across their lands. For a moment, it seemed the nightmare had ended. The killings slowed. Villages began to heal. Families that once barred their doors at night reopened their homes. The fear that had paralyzed travel loosened its grip, and pilgrims once again walked the roads with cautious songs on their lips. It felt like the story had closed, like Europe had defeated the darkness that lived among its people. But the true climax came not in the victory, but in the twist that followed. As soldiers searched the forest for the last remnants of the Brotherhood, they found something chilling. In caves and hidden shelters, in ruined chapels and abandoned barns, they uncovered not just weapons and cloaks, but scrolls, parchments filled with symbols, chants, and records of oaths sworn by firelight. The documents revealed something horrifying. The Brotherhood was not one group, not one kingdom's curse, but part of a vast network spread across Europe. Each cell was tied to another, like branches of a tree with roots buried deep. The killers who had been unmasked were only a fraction, perhaps even a sacrifice, meant to distract from the greater whole. This revelation changed everything. The victory, though real, was incomplete. The people who had been captured or killed were only pieces of a larger design, their defeat a warning rather than an ending. The true Brotherhood, the records hinted, still thrived in hidden valleys, in abbeys where no one dared to look, in the courts of kings who secretly protected them. The network was too wide, too silent, too patient to be undone in one night. The final twist left Europe unsettled. Yes, the killings slowed. Yes, villages began to breathe again. But no one could be sure how long it would last. Every face in the market, every pilgrim on the road, could still belong to the unseen Brotherhood. The killers had been unmasked, but the shadow they cast lingered, long and deep. Some whispered that the Brotherhood was waiting, that centuries later it would rise again, its roots stronger than ever. Others believed it never truly disappeared, only changed its mask, weaving itself into new forms of power. And so, even in the climax of this medieval terror, there was no neat ending. The people of the Middle Ages lived with both relief and unease, caught between the triumph of unmasking their tormentors and the dread of knowing that behind every closed door, in every darkened forest, the Brotherhood might still be waiting. The story closed on a silence that felt less like peace and more like the breath drawn before the next storm. When the storm of fear finally began to settle, the people of medieval Europe were left with something more powerful than the memory of the killings themselves. They were left with questions. Who had truly been behind the Brotherhood? Why had ordinary men and women, neighbors and friends, been lured into such a secret world of violence? And, perhaps most haunting of all, how much of it had been stopped, and how much was still quietly alive in the shadows? The discovery of scrolls and parchments had unsettled both nobles and priests. Some were burned immediately, declared too dangerous to keep. Others were locked away in abbeys, guarded as forbidden knowledge. But whispers spread about what they contained, rituals that promised power, oaths that demanded loyalty, and the chilling idea that the killings had been less about survival and more about control. The Brotherhood had not simply taken lives at random. They had built their strength by choosing their victims carefully. Merchants, pilgrims, and travelers carried stories, connections, and influence. By removing them, the killers disrupted trade, broke communication, and sowed distrust. They weren't just spilling blood. They were reshaping the medieval world itself. In the aftermath, Europe tried to repair the damage. Roads that had once fallen silent began to open again, though guarded heavily by soldiers and patrols. Inns along the pilgrim routes filled once more with cautious travelers. Trade resumed, though it moved slower, weighed down by the memory of what had happened. The church declared the defeat of the killers a triumph of faith, but beneath the sermons there was unease. Priests knew that evil had not vanished. It had only retreated, waiting for its moment to return. Kings, too, claimed victory, but their soldiers kept doubling their watch, for even they did not fully believe the threat was gone. Families that had lost loved ones tried to mend, but the wounds went deeper than absence. Some had recognized the faces of their kin among the killers, and that memory never left them. To imagine a son or brother stolen away and returned as an enemy was a pain no sermon could ease. Villages spoke less openly about it, as if silence could smooth over the cracks, but the truth remained just beneath the surface. Even in victory, fear lingered in the heart of the common people. Yet from this shadowed history came lessons that shaped the way people saw the world. Travelers no longer walked blindly into the night. They carried lanterns, prayed more fervently, and built communities of trust. The story of the Brotherhood became a warning passed down through generations. Parents told children never to wander alone, not just because of wolves or bandits, but because of the memory of what people themselves were capable of. The killers became less of a physical enemy and more of a symbol, a reminder of how darkness could grow quietly among ordinary lives if left unchecked. As centuries moved forward, chroniclers wrote about these times in guarded words. Some described them as a test of faith, proof that the strength of the church had pushed back the devil's influence. Others framed it as a political struggle, evidence of how kingdoms nearly broke under the weight of distrust. A few, more careful writers hinted at the deeper truth, that the killers were not some outside force, but part of society itself, born from the cracks of fear, poverty, and ambition. These records, scattered and incomplete, became the fragments we study now, trying to piece together the story of one of the darkest mysteries of medieval life. The resolution was not one of triumph alone, but of survival. The people endured, and in their endurance, they found resilience. They carried forward not just the scars, but also the wisdom that safety was never guaranteed, that trust must be guarded, and that fear could be as deadly as any blade. The Brotherhood, whether fully destroyed or merely diminished, lost its power in the light of recognition. Once unmasked, its terror no longer held the same weight. People realized that what made the killers so frightening was not their strength, but the uncertainty they thrived upon. By naming them, by facing them, medieval society reclaimed some measure of control. The final twist of the story, the knowledge that the Brotherhood may never have truly disappeared, added to the mystery that still fascinates us today. Did they dissolve into history, leaving only their legend behind? Or did they adapt, hiding within new structures, perhaps even shaping parts of society in unseen ways? These questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is why their story has lasted so long. It is not only a tale of crime or cruelty. It is a tale of how fear can shape a whole age, and how people find ways to live even when terror presses in from every side. In the end, what matters most is not the killings themselves, but the resilience of those who survived them. Medieval men and women, ordinary villagers, traders, and pilgrims, showed a strength often overlooked in grand histories. They faced not only the hardships of plague, famine, and war, but also the shadow of human cruelty. And still they endured. Still they prayed. Still they rebuilt their lives after every loss. That endurance is perhaps the greatest resolution of this story, the quiet victory of the human spirit against fear. As the story draws to a close, one can almost picture the scene. A medieval village at dusk, smoke curling gently from chimneys, children laughing in the distance, elders gathered at the hearth. The terror of the Brotherhood may have scarred them, but life continued, carrying both memory and hope. The killers became shadows of the past, their names fading into legend, while the resilience of ordinary people carried forward into the future. And perhaps that is the true takeaway. The history of the most notorious killers of medieval times is not just about violence or fear. It is about the strength of communities, the courage of faith, and the reminder that darkness, no matter how powerful, cannot fully silence the human will to endure. It leaves us with both a warning and a reflection. Evil often wears familiar faces, but so does hope. And in the long stretch of history, it is hope that has always endured the longest.